Welcome to Unveiling Death. I am Rabbi Jeffrey Weil. Mourner's Kaddish without God. Humanistic Judaism and Death with Rabbi Adam Chalom. Rabbi Adam Chalom is Dean of the North American chapter of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. He serves on the executive committee of the Association of Humanistic Rabbis and on the editorial board of Humanistic Judaism magazine. Rabbi Chalom is also co-editor of the book Contemporary Humanistic Judaism: Beliefs, Values, Practices. He has served Kol Kaddish Humanistic Congregation since 2004. I'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to me at rabbiw14@gmail.com, and please follow and share Unveiling Death. Here's my conversation with Rabbi Adam Chalom. Rabbi Adam Chalom, thank you so much for talking to me on Unveiling Death.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Glad to join you.
So can we begin actually with a brief description, your elevator speech, Humanistic Judaism, what's that?
Humanistic Judaism celebrates a cultural Jewish identity through a human-focused approach to life. So for us, Jewishness includes things like holidays and life cycle events and what's conventionally called religious literature, except we understand all of those as part of Jewish culture. So that's a broader understanding of Jewish identity to include music, food, history, languages, and also to appreciate that these were all created by people. If you think of Judaism through a religious lens, you think it all came down from Sinai or from the sainted rabbis. But our approach is it was made by people over time. It changed over time. It was influenced by other cultures from which it adopted and adapted certain elements. So if Judaism was made by people, it can be remade and adapted by people in our own day in response to our own needs and values. So then when we try to clarify what are our needs, what are our values, we realize that many people live their life focused on this world, this life, and what people can do for themselves. They emphasize human knowledge rather than divine revelation, human power rather than miracles, and human responsibility rather than relying on cosmic justice to make sure everything turns out all right. If there are wicked people to be punished, we have to do it. If there are good people to be rewarded, we have to ensure they get their just deserts. If there's going to be justice in the world, it's going to be made by human hands and human minds. So that humanistic, that human-focused approach to life is really focused on the natural world, on this life, which as far as we know is the only life we have, and on what people can do individually and together to understand and improve the world, and to celebrate what they have in common, which for Jewish communities includes this Jewish cultural inheritance, again, that was made by people a long time ago and can be adapted and chosen from by people today.
Okay, so when I have officiated for funerals, I find that people who are basically secular, they belong to non-humanistic congregations like mine, Reform or conservative or whatever, but they're basically living secular lives, and they might even have doubts about God's role in our lives. But when it comes to death, approaching death or mourning rituals, suddenly they become very interested in tradition. And they might completely trafe, lobster out, and yet they want to know exactly what to do for Shiva and like what readings we're going to have during the funeral service and so forth. So, and it makes me think, the old adage, there are no atheists in foxholes. I actually did know an atheist who said he had half of his tush blown off in a foxhole, and yet he said during that time and afterwards he remained an atheist. But I'm wondering for you, having worked with people who have chosen to belong or connect to somehow humanistic Judaism, have you ever had the experience where someone is coming close to, really facing their mortality or the mortality of a loved one, and has like at a vulnerable moment, perhaps a more, I guess, heart as opposed to head moment, said, will I see my loved one in heaven, or am I going to heaven? Like those, in a sense, foxhole moments.
I really haven't had that experience many times, because the people who have found their way to a humanistic congregation and been members of one have thought through those questions generally and have come to a comfortable landing place on it. They're not sort of living in the what if, maybe, I don't know, area that many secularized people tend to be, who aren't thinking through the implications of their life philosophy. And if someone were to say something like that to me, my approach is it's this person's interpretation of the human experience. One of the core principles of a humanistic Judaism is that people get to make up their own minds and think for themselves. And so I read this experience as being all there is, that my consciousness is caught up in the electrical signals in my brain, and when those are over, then so am I. But someone else will read that same experience in different ways and believe in things that I may not agree with. And I affirm their right to believe what they choose to believe. I'm not going to lie and say that I believe what they believe, but I might take the approach of, well, some people think that that's true, and other people find it meaningful to focus on this life here and now and to do what they can while they're here, or to leave good memories behind with people who love them. I think there is a courage in facing a finite reality, and there's a comfort that's provided by affirming those feelings of loss when they're really gone. After all, even if there is a heaven a long ways away, the rest of your life, the survivor, you're not going to have this person with you. You're not going to be able to touch them or hear them or, connect with them in that way. You can talk to them, but if they talk back to you, then you may have some other things to investigate. But the reality is that for the rest of your life, you're going to have to face this loss. And in some ways, it's almost more satisfying and comforting to affirm they're gone for the rest of your time on earth. If there's a reunion later, okay. If not, this may be it. And there's also a comfort that comes from understanding that as far as we know, in the world, in the history of the earth, everything that lives will die. This is the way of all living things. And so we are a part of the natural world. We go back to the natural world. I mean, there's that classic Genesis line, from dust we come, to dust we are. There's a scientific truth behind that too. And so we're connected to the natural world, and that means that we who live will die. There is life that comes from our own death and the repurposing of the, atoms and so on that get into the ground and into the flowers and into the world. But our consciousness will end, and in some ways facing that reality has its own consolation. So if someone came to me and said, I believe in a heaven, I'm not going to say you're wrong. I might say, I believe differently, but it's good that it works for you. That's right. Part of the humanistic affirmation of making up their own minds.
If they said, Rabbi, is it possible that I'll see my loved one, or is it possible that I or my loved one will go to heaven? How would you, bedside, respond to that?
Well, as far as I know, I don't live my life planning that way. Mm-hmm. I want to make the most out of the time I have here and now with the people I love and who love me. And if there's a happy ending over the rainbow, great, that's a bonus. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to assume that's going to be the case and miss out on an opportunity here and now. So I wouldn't do a head-on confrontation that I think I'm right and you're wrong. I don't think that's appropriate, and I also don't think that's therapeutic for them. But I would try to, again, redirect to what I can do. I had this case happen once where a member asked if she could give me her cousin's Hebrew name so I could recite some prayers for her, who's dealing with the relapse of breast cancer. And I said, I have a better idea. Why don't you give me her phone number and I'll call her, and maybe we'll talk about the condition and what's happening and she'll feel better. Or maybe we'll talk about the Chicago Cubs and she'll either feel better or worse, distracting her from that. But she'll feel that someone cares about her. Someone will have reached out to her and she will feel less alone. We know that positive attitude can make a difference in diagnosis and in prognosis going forward. And we also know that even if it's a terminal situation, there are things people can do in the time they have to make that time meaningful. I just think that personal contact, the human-to-human contact, is so much more meaningful than words sent out into the universe that may or may not have any impact on what actually happens.
For sure. I get that. So do you, in your congregation, you don't do healing prayers?
No. So we do create a space for people to reflect and to share the names of people who are dealing with health conditions. We do have an adapted version of Debbie Friedman's Misha Berach, which is more like the strength that we get from within ourselves that can provide support and healing. But no, we're not looking to send the traditional words up and out. We actually, in our congregation's Shabbat service, light a series of candles on a 7-candle menorah. That's loosely like what the Unitarians do with their Joys and Concerns candle lighting. We call it something Jewish, Simcha and Suras. Simchas are joys, Suras is difficult moments. But that way you could light a candle in celebration of something wonderful or in concern for someone who's facing an illness or a difficult time. And a lot of times people will light candles, sometimes in memory too, in the spirit of a yahrzeit kind of candle. But a lot of times they'll light candles for people who are facing surgery or dealing with illness. And it's their way of sharing their name, but sharing in the community so that people know what's going on and can offer their support that way.
Right. You mentioned returning unto dust, right? And that having a regenerative, or that will have a regenerative impact on the earth. You've also in the past talked about a sort of natural immortality. I think that was the term that you used, natural immortality, in which we are remembered and that in which our good deeds, have an influence after we're dead. So my question about that concept of natural immortality, and I like the phrase a lot, but doesn't natural immortality really mean mortality? Like for the person, for me, Jeffrey, I might be remembered fondly or negatively, and my body will, in its small, scrawny way, nourish a little patch of earth and, whatever. But there's no Jeffrey in the natural immortality concept. There's no Jeffrey to continue being Jeffrey.
Yes, you are correct. That if you don't believe in a personal immortality, the end of your individual consciousness is the end. And that can be very hard to imagine. I mean, it's almost inconceivable to imagine a world without me in it.
Yeah.
I've never experienced it. I can't picture it. I remember once, I think I was in graduate school and I was in a traffic jam. And I looked around at all the other cars and I realized none of them knew who I was or that I existed. I didn't matter at all. I could not exist, and it would not change their life in one iota, other than one less car on the freeway blocking their path. So the world will spin. The world continues without us. It's hard to imagine. That's why so many cultures are unwilling to accept that the end is the end, whether it's a reincarnation belief or an afterlife or, any other variety of denial of the fact that the end is the end. We have this sort of emotional need to not let go. But I think the flip side of that is if you accept that indeed you are mortal, you can make meaning out of that. There was one time Richard Dawkins, the celebrated English atheist, was asked, if you don't believe in heaven, how can you get up in the morning? And he said, that's why I get up in the morning. I've only got so many mornings, in my 80 plus years to predict for my life. And that's why I want to get up and learn things and experience things and create things and write things. It's because this is the time I have. It makes it more meaningful if it's shorter.
Right.
So, yes, it is not a personal immortality where my consciousness lives on forever, but it's a realistic approach to the reality of death and making the most of it so that when death does come, you might be willing to say, I had a good run. I had a positive impact on people. These are the ways that they'll remember me. And okay, I found in my own family experience and with other families that when the person who's dying is willing to let go, it's still hard for the family, but it's less hard than if the person dying is fighting and fighting and fighting until the end and is in a lot of pain and pushing back on it and is not willing to say, okay.
Right. There's also something about, there's a humility aspect to accepting the ends of oneself, right? It's an ego extinction. If we refuse to acknowledge death, like there's going to be a life later on, there's going to be some existence later on, or there'll be a reunion later on, and that, will be reunited or live on or have a feeling or be even at peace, honestly, that's very egocentric.
I think it's also really maladaptive for a tragic death circumstance. If we're talking about somebody in their 90s who's dying, that's one thing. We're talking about a death of a child or somebody who dies in a car accident or has a sudden stroke or something. And then you get these sort of palliative statements that are made like God needed another angel or, they're in a better place. And you're thinking, no, this stinks. This is terrible.
It's just bad.
And sometimes as a rabbi, I found affirming how people are feeling by saying, this is not the way it's supposed to be. Your father dying at 60, he never got to see his grandkids, that's terrible. And you're allowed to be mad. You're allowed to be upset, as opposed to trying to, calm it down. You'll get over it. It's okay. He's in a better place. It's all part of the divine plan. There's another angel.
Bromides, unhelpful bromides.
Exactly. And so sometimes affirming the anger, affirming the pain is actually more healing because it resonates with what's in their heart.
Yeah. I know Blue Greenberg, the Orthodox Jewish thinker, Blue and Irv Yitzhak Greenberg's son died in a bike accident in Israel a number of years ago. And I read an article that she wrote where people would approach her with all these bromides, these cliched things. And like someone said, like, something like God wanted him. And her response was, I wanted him more. So there's sort of parenthetically, there's sort of like, I don't know, a mini podcast industry or YouTube video industry on NDEs, near-death experiences. It seems to be talked about a lot these days. What's your response to that?
Well, my take on it is a little bit like William James, the psychologist from a little over 100 years ago, in his Varieties of Religious Experience, where he describes how many different religious traditions describe this psychological phenomena, but it's their interpretation of a common brain experience. So when your brain is deprived of oxygen, it can cause that kind of tunnel vision view that many people report. And it does crazy things to the mind. So many of these near-death experiences are a function of the brain functioning as it does in extreme circumstances. And then we tend to put our meaning into it. This also happens with mystical experiences that are reported, caused by fasting or substances or, physical behaviors. But it's very rare that a Jewish mystic meets Muhammad or a Muslim mystic meets Jesus, because it's our brain filtering this sensory input or the processing quirkiness through our pre-existing lenses of belief and values. So the people who are inclined to believe near-death experiences often have a pre-existing religious condition that encourages them to think in those categories. When secular people have them, and there's actually a volume of atheists who've had these kind of experiences, writing about their experience, and they don't necessarily take it that way. Now, there are conversion moments, and that does happen, but I don't think that it proves a supernatural reality any more than these mystical, experiences prove that that's the truth of the universe. We find truth through evidence and reason and repeatable experiment and, individual testimony. Any criminologist will tell you is very unreliable. How much more so when you're in an extreme physical or mental condition?
Right. I'll just say this for the record. And if God is listening, I want that. I want a near-death experience that continues well into death and unto eternity, just in case. Not just in case. I really want that. But I thought I had to say that.
Okay, fine. I'll be pleasantly surprised if it's true, but sure. I'm not banking on it.
Well, let me ask you a question about that. It's somewhat off topic and yet not. So you were raised in the humanistic Jewish tradition. And I'm guessing a lot of your colleagues in the humanistic Jewish world as clergy, I'm guessing a lot of them were not raised in that tradition. Did you ever wonder, like, if you had not been raised this way, if you would still be this way? Not that it's a condition, like a bad condition, but like,
no, I hear
did that ever
you.
cross your mind?
I mean, it's the same dilemma for anyone in any religious tradition who stayed where they started, which is, am I just this out of inertia or because it's easier or because then I agree with my parents, or have I not examined all the evidence out there? I mean, you could ask the same question about why I didn't become Muslim, Buddhist, any of the other Rastafarian. I mean, there's a gazillion options out there. And how many of us have really truly given each of them a fair shake to investigate the potential that they could be the one true religion? Probably most of us have not. So it makes sense to me. I've had experiences with more religious Judaisms in a variety of ways. I've certainly studied them throughout my training and my career. I have plenty of colleagues today, like yourself, who are in a different place religiously in the Jewish world. The counterfactual of if I'd been raised differently, my mom likes to say this Yiddish saying, if de Baba hat gewinne Zeta, which is if the grandmother had been a grandfather, like,
right,
everything would be different.
Right.
So I can't say what would have been. I mean, this does make sense to me. And a lot of people who become humanistic Jews, having been raised something else, in many cases, they had doubts for a long time. And so even if they were raised in a Reformed temple, as you know, not all Reformed Jews in membership are Reformed Jews in theology, right? And so they had their doubts to begin with. Or in some cases, they were true believers. I mean, you get people who leave Haredi ultra-Orthodoxy because they have a lot of questions and they're not finding the answers, and they begin to investigate, and they move sometimes in a very secular direction. And it's just a function of their making their best effort to understand the truth. There are things that I do that are more traditional than the way I was raised. So, for example, my wife and I do our version of Passover kosher for that 1 week. We don't keep kosher the rest of the year, but for the, leavened bread and so on, we do our version of avoiding it because it's meaningful to us. But that's, again, the empowerment of saying this was a culture made by people that we've inherited. And because when you inherit something, it becomes yours. You're not a museum curator who has to keep it exactly the same. You can adapt it and shape it.
So the Jewish funeral service, interment typically ends or very close to the end, depending on one's tradition, with Mourner's Kaddish. Mourner's Kaddish is in Aramaic. It has a rhythm to it. It does not mention death, but it does mention God and God's attributes throughout that minute of saying Mourner's Kaddish. So, I know the humanistic Jewish funeral service would typically void of mentions of God, which would include no 23rd Psalm either, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, which is also typically standard. But I'm interested in Mourner's Kaddish because I believe that there is a humanistic Jewish Mourner's Kaddish, and I'm wondering if you could say something about that. What is that?
Sure. There's actually many examples of humanistic Kaddishes. It's hard to pluralize it, right? We're not used to that, but there are many varieties of approaches to that or responses to that. Some of them are in Hebrew and English rather than Aramaic. Some of them are mostly in English. The one that I tend to use, there's an Aramaic version and an English translation of that. It was written by Sherwin Wine, as one of our founding thinkers. I like it because it has that cadence to it, but it's been shifted. Instead of praising Shemei Rabbah, the great name, it's praise for Shlomo Ba'alma, which is peace in the world. So the focus is, instead of on God, it's on this world and on the peace that we seek for ourselves, the peace that perhaps the deceased has found. And so it's focused more on peace. But it can have that same rhythm. Yit Gadal v'yit Gadash Shlomo Ba'alma. Nivra Shlomo Chirutana v'namlich malchutei. So you have that same phrasing, but it's focused on Shlomo, on the peace, as opposed to Shemei, the name. At the end of certain lines, we say V'imru Shalom, we say Shalom instead of Amen. And then the last verse, instead of Hu Oseh Shalom, he makes peace, we sing Na'aseh Shalom, we make peace, and not B'mramav in the heights, but Ba'olam in the world. So it has a similar cadence, but the shift in the words works for us to feel like we're confidently living in a humanistic cadence and rhythm and vocabulary in our life. And now I do have some funerals where the family really wants the traditional Kaddish, in which case I'm happy to have a family member to whom it's meaningful recited for them. As you may know, actually in Eastern Europe, sometimes you would refer to your eldest male younger relative as your Kaddish. They were the person who would be reciting that for you. So to have a family member lead the Kaddish is eminently appropriate. If they really want the traditional Kaddish, then that's fine. If they want the humanistic Kaddish, I'm happy to do that. And some people don't want the traditional Kaddish because they know what it means and they don't believe it, but they don't feel authentic changing it. So they don't like a changed version. So then we'll find another poem by Leah Goldberg or Yehuda Amichai or some other reading that might work in Hebrew and English or just in English that has not the same sound and cadence, but fits the same emotional need of having some Jewish literary passage to mark that moment in the process of the funeral service.
I like that you really do keep the cadence by using some of those words, Yit Gadal v'Yikadash, just the greatness and the holiness, although holiness, Yit Gadash is also kind of an interesting word to use in that context, but it can be understood in various ways, I know, but I do appreciate that. And I appreciate this conversation, Rabbi Adam Shalom. It's been really a pleasure and illuminating.
Great. It was a pleasure to talk and happy to talk again if it'd be helpful in the future.
Thank you so much.
Many thanks to Rabbi Adam Shalom. Thank you to Unveiling Death's editor, Bethany Subam Milano. Share this episode, follow this podcast, and thank you for listening to Unveiling Death, Eternity in About 24 Minutes.